Every October, when there's a slight chill in the air, ghosts, ghouls, and goblins stir the imagination, and one figure that has become inextricably linked to Halloween is that of the witch. While all these ghoulish figures come from folklore, the witch stands out because of the direct connection between her image and the actual events of the past. But where does this idea of the witch come from? The fact is that witches, as we know them today, developed from a very specific stereotype that formed during the witch hunts of early modern Europe. Hello everyone, and welcome to a special spooky edition of history where we talk about the stereotype of the witch. When you think of a witch, you probably think of a woman with a hat, a broom, a cat, and a cauldron. But why women in particular, and why these specific items? Well, these items were associated with women's tasks and women's chores. Women used cauldrons to cook, they used brooms to sweep, and they usually wore wide-brimmed hats for gardening. These hats were actually pretty typical in early modern society. So using these items at the time wouldn't have seemed out of place. It was the way in which they used these items that was different. Women who usually used the broom to sweep would use it to fly on if they were a witch. They would use a cauldron to cook, and then they would use it to brew potions and cast spells if they were a witch. So basically it's taking these household items and turning them on their head, using them for a sinister purpose. And that's mostly because women were actually legally powerless in society. So people were very concerned about what women got up to on their own when left to their own devices at home. There was a misconception that it was magic that was the problem. But that's not really the case. People used magic all the time in their everyday lives. They carried talismans to protect them. They went to church where the priest would bless the bread and wine and it would turn into the body and blood of Jesus. The Bible is filled with stories of magic. And so it wasn't really magic that was the problem. It was the way that magic was used and where the magic was coming from. Women had very few legitimate outlets in which they could actually have access to magic. So the outlets that they did have tended to be ones that were looked at as questionable, especially since medical science and things like that were also looked at as magic. Midwives in particular were vulnerable to this because they were working in the health industry very close to what people saw as magic. When we think of a witch, we tend to think of an old hag, usually with a long, warty nose, white hair, and just generally a mean personality. This is due to the fact that older women were more likely to be widows. Widows lived on the outsides of society. They weren't necessarily under the control of a man, and that made people uncomfortable. And so there was a fear of what they might be getting up to, what sort of power they might be using. In addition, being older and having lost their looks,
How do you know she is a witch? She looks like one.
people in society tended to make judgments about them and their character, especially if they did tend to have a more abrasive personality, which was common for older people, particularly with the onset of senility.
You find my mama again.
However, there was another type of witch which also becomes associated with the witches that we see around Halloween, and that's the witch as temptress. Really, there's a hag-temptress dichotomy when it comes to witches in popular culture and in media. And so we see this a lot, including in famous movies like Hocus Pocus, where we'll see Sarah representing this temptress witch, whereas Winifred will represent the hag version of the witch. The reason that women in particular were associated with temptation and why the temptress witch became such a popular stereotype was because of the mistrust that the church had for women's sexuality. One of the beliefs about how women became witches, in fact, was that they might be having sex with the devil, and that the devil would leave their mark on these women's bodies as perhaps an extra teat that the devil could suckle from. This gets into the idea of women as nurturers, caregivers, mothers, that kind of thing, except again, much like with the household items, turns it on its head and uses it for an evil purpose rather than a life-giving purpose. All of this goes back to the story of Adam and Eve, the idea that it was the devil that tempted Eve and that Eve was the one who tempted Adam. So as the devil was the temptress for women, women became the temptress for men. The Malleus Maleficarum, which meant the hammer of witches, was basically a manual of how to find witches and how to get them to confess. It claimed that women were more likely to be controlled by the devil because the original rib removed from Adam to create woman was bent. The strange thing about this is that it sort of implies that God made women imperfect, which doesn't really make sense with the idea of an infallible creator. But these are details, right? This is why we sometimes see the witch not as an old crone, but instead as a beautiful young woman who's alluring and who draws people in. The fear is that she's going to draw men in and basically poison them in one way or another, either through actual poison or by poisoning their souls. Beautiful women are also associated with the devil in other forms of popular culture.
Do I look like somebody who tried to trick you?
This is because women are thought of as being closer to the devil. All of this comes out of this early modern idea of women as temptress. So you can see there's a clear link between what we see as the witch now and the stereotype of the witch that developed in early modern Europe during the witch hunts. Most works presented the witch as monstrous. They might be riding a broom backwards. They were supposed to worship the devil rather than God, harmed children rather than mother them, and basically reversed the natural expectations of womanhood. Sometimes they were also said to deprive men of their power or of their manhood. And these were deep-seated fears in early modern Europe that have seeped into our culture and are still with us today.
She turned me into a newt. A newt. Got better.
So everything we associate today with the witch was part of a stereotype involving fears of the upturn of society. This included everything from women in power and the household objects that they used.
Look at it! The new Nimbus 2000!
To women's sexuality and the changing nature of women over the course of time, from being young and having children, which in itself was looked at as somewhat magical, to aging and becoming the old hag stereotype. The history of witchcraft is clearly still with us today and shows up in our literature and our movies and, of course, every October 31st. Happy Halloween, everyone.